Okay, so welcome everyone to the Chaos OSPO working group meeting for Thursday, February 19th. As always, this meeting falls under the Chaos Code of Conduct, so please be kind to each other. As you can see, we are recording this one, so that's the first item on the agenda. So we've decided to record it. We can stop the recording at any point if somebody wants to have a more frank discussion off the record, so to speak. Before I turn it over to Natalia, we have a couple of people that I don't know that I've seen before in this meeting. I don't know if you want to introduce yourself. It is totally optional. You don't have to. But we'd be happy to have you do some introductions if you'd like.
Sure, I can go first. I just joined. My name is Diego Mastroianni. I work as the OSPO head of OSPO for Cloudera. I was We actually met last year in Napa, Dawn. I
Yeah.
was the OSPO for Moody's at the time, so I changed in between, and it's my first time attending the meeting. So yes, um,
Yeah, very good.
happy to be
Yeah,
here.
welcome. Welcome. Anybody else? Okay. So we'll go ahead and get started. I will stop sharing so that I can turn it over to Natalia to get started with our agenda item.
Yes, thank you. And I will be taking over the screen share. Okay, actually before that, I'm Natalia Luzuriaga. I'm a software engineer as part of the open source program office at the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. And today we'll be talking about our organization's practices with archiving repositories. This has been one of my main projects starting the beginning of this year. So lately, our OSPO has been kind of focused on the repository lifecycle, where first our major focus was establishing our baseline tools, which started out with creating repository templates for our organizations and thus forward assisting those development teams with maintaining those repositories. And then we've been thinking of the rest of the life cycle, one path which we call the path of growth. So as a open source project matures further in their journey, how best can we assist them as an OSPO? And the other side of it, the path of archival. So how do we assist repositories that have reached the end of life? So today I'll be focusing specifically on the path of archival. And how exactly we go about sunsetting repositories in our organization. Okay, and then I will share screen. So to kind of start off with brainstorming and trying to figure out what are the best practices to go along with this, we actually turned towards CHAOSS's practitioner guide on sunsetting, which was written by Dawn. And here, this is a very comprehensive and wonderful guide about how exactly you go about archiving repositories. So first, she talks about identifying trends using metrics that, using chaos metrics. And then from there, based on those trends and metrics, that's when you can diagnose a repository as ready to be archived or identify its candidacy for archived. And there's also some other recommended metrics and data that you can use along with your consideration. And then finally is actually making the actual change of archiving the repository. And so here we have some action items that are listed out, such as updating the README, updating communication channels and documentation accordingly, and notifying users. And then you can also do an additional step of adding your code to software heritage to ensure that it is preserved over time, and some cautions and considerations. So after reading this guide, we decided to focus on this step over here. What exactly does our organization need to do in order to, what we should do when we archive a repository? And so based on this guide, we came up with our own checklist based on this. of how we want to prepare a repository for archive. So for instance, first we want to review the metadata of the project. We have a file called code.json, which includes all metadata about a repository. So we want to be able to mark the status of the repository as archival in that metadata. So it reflects its new status. And then from there, we go through a thorough repository review where we update the documentation, such as the README. We look through the repository's issues, close what has been fixed, comment on what has been unresolved, label the issues accordingly. And for those that won't be fixed, label that too. Then we assess who has access to the repository. Then we perform a lightweight security review for secrets, keys, PII. And then we do some minor housekeeping, like deleting some branches. And then for repositories that are a bit more mature in their journey, such as they accept contributions from the external community, that's when we review the pull requests, make sure that we merge those that are ready to be merged, merge any dependabot PRs so that our dependencies can be up to date, comment on open PRs, and close won't fix PRs. And for those repositories that have a wiki or Slack channel or just more means of communications outside a regular GitHub repository, we also note to review that and to notify parties in those spaces. And then finally, we have a little more thorough security review where we review the code quality, the commit history, run some code scanning and security alert tools. We check out the change log and then we review the release and tags. So just doing a thorough review of the repository to make sure that all of our bases are covered before we mark the repository as README, as archived. Okay, cool. And then so based on all this information I just shared with you, our team, we created a tool to kind of automate some of that work called Repo Sunsetter. And this is essentially a GitHub action that prepares a repository for archival by creating an issue that posts all these action items from this checklist I shared. And it automates some of that work, such as adding some text to the README to inform users about the repository being archived and updating the project metadata accordingly. Okay, cool. And then I'm going to do a little demo. So I have this test repository over here, and then I'm going to run this GitHub action on this repository by first creating a new workflow file. Cool. Okay, this is the workflow file over here. You want to make sure that the GitHub action has permissions to write pull requests and to write issues, and to also write contents within the files of the repository. And then here we just have this one step over here where we actually run the repo sunsetter tool. Okay, I'm going to switch this over to another branch that I have that has a little bit more features than what's currently on main right now. I'm just going to do this over here. Okay, cool. Okay, and then I'm going to name the file archive repo.yaml. Okay, cool. So now that we have the workflow file, we can easily run this action in the UI. This is it over here. And then we run the workflow. Cool. Okay, and then we're gonna wait a minute or two to let this finish. Okay, cool. In the meantime, I wanted to ask the audience, does your organization have their own archival practices? Just curious to see like how exactly you guys go about it. No, no. Okay, cool.
Yeah. It's actually very timely because we are talking about archiving one project
Oh,
right now. So
cool.
I was kind of doing this checklist. I mean, I've never been. It's serendipity. So thank you so much.
Okay, cool. That's really good to hear. Yes, I hope this we decided to make this a GitHub action because we know this is a shared challenge that OSPOs go through. So we hope that you can also make use of it too. Yes. Okay,
It's
cool.
very thoughtful. Thanks for sharing all of this.
Yes, of course, of course. Okay. Let's see. While she's building, let's see. I think I can talk a little bit more about diagnosing repositories. Um, let's see. Feel free to step in, Don, too. But um, another, my team and I were also creating another tool to assist with diagnosing repositories as being candidates for archival. And some of the interesting metrics that we've been looking at mostly in this guide is the number of open and closed change requests that a repository has, since that indicates whether a project is still maintained or if other people have been making pull requests to it. It just indicates activity. We also have new issues, so that indicates whether the external community is still looking at the repository, since users can post bugs, ask questions, or request for new features through new issues. And then technical forks. This is a big one. So people that fork your project, we want to kind of assess usage within that fork to actually see if people are building on top of the upstream stuff that you did. Mhm. Yeah, so we've been looking at these metrics and kind of just been experimenting with using these metrics to identify repos for archival. And I hope to share that work in a next CHAOSS OSPO working group. Okay, cool. And then we're going to look to the actions over here. Okay, cool. It looks like our GitHub action repo sunsetter has run successfully. And so as a result, it should have done three things. Let's see. It should have created a new issue with the archival checklist that I went over. So the idea is we post this as an issue so that the repository, the development team can go through this checklist now that they know how exactly they should prepare the repository for archival. Yeah, cool. And then notice that we have two items that have already been checked over here, and that's because we actually automated that work. So we should have two pull requests up in this repository. Okay, cool. One is updating the project metadata, and for our organization, our repository metadata lives in a code.json file. So we indicate its archival status, and I think we add it as a tag. Yep. And then the last thing is we add a archive notice to the README. So this is how that PR looks like. And this is the text that we provided. Cool. And this is how it looks like. We use the warning banner as part of GitHub's markdown rendering. Yeah. Okay, cool. And that's pretty much it for our repo sunsetter tool. Yeah, I think that's all that I have to demo for today. Yes. But any thoughts, any questions? And I'll share some links in chat. Mhm.
And just to add to this, I think the team is actually planning on contributing some of this back to the sunsetting guide, which I'm super excited about because so Diego, if you're looking at this right now, I would have a look at their checklist because the practitioner guide is missing a few things that we just didn't think of. So I'm really looking forward to getting some contributions to the sunsetting guide from the CMS team. I think that's really exciting.
Cool. And then we have Remy de Cosmaker who's on the call. He's the open source lead at our OSPO. Yes.
Yeah, and we just got word yesterday that our talk at the GWU OSCON conference has been approved. So we were accepted to present, and our agency has approved that. So we're going to be presenting about Repo Sunsetter and the CHAOSS Practitioner Guide on March 23rd or 24th. at George Washington University here in DC. And I believe they're going to record it. So should be a good moment. You folks are the first to hear about it, though. The working group here, as fellow practitioners, Nat shipped this yesterday, I think. So this is fresh, brand new, off the press. We wanted to make sure to engage with the OSPO community. We definitely appreciate the feedback here. We couldn't have put this together without the CHAOSS practitioner guide. We leaned on it heavily, so we really look forward to contributing back up. And that's going to be one of the key elements of the presentation is, making sure that these upstream contributions are made back and that we can share those out with the GW OSCON.
That's great. Great. Congrats on getting that talk accepted. That's awesome. Other questions for Natalia or thoughts that people have on sunsetting and archiving repositories?
Natalia, I'm not all that familiar with GitHub Actions, so I'm looking at it on your repo. I'm just trying to figure out how would I saw how you would use it. How would I graph that into a flow that I might try to do?
Yeah, for sure. Let's see. So to actually use the action, okay, I'm gonna steal the screen share again. You can simply copy and paste this text over here and add
Okay.
it to a, okay, so first you identify the repository that you'd like to prepare for archival. And from there, we will run the GitHub action on. And so to run GitHub actions, you have to go to the workflows directory in the within the .github directory. And here is where your GitHub action files live. And then
Oh,
from there, you can create a file with those contents within that folder and then name it accordingly. Archive repo 2.yaml. Oh, and GitHub action files are written as YAML files. Yeah. Okay, cool. And then you have this actions tab over here where you can run the GitHub actions that live in this file over here. And then so here are the actions that you can run on the side. And so I'm going to click on archive repository. Cool. And then from there, there's a button that says run workflow, and then you can run the workflow. Yeah.
nice. Thank you.
Yeah, it's super easy.
I saw another one that you had in that list, stale repo identifier.
Oh, that one's a cool one, actually. So that GitHub action was created by the GitHub OSPO, and it basically identifies repositories that have been inactive within 6 months. So you give it your GitHub organization name, and then you run it as a GitHub action, and then it identifies all the repositories in your organization that have been inactive for that period of time. Yeah, so we were kind of doing some experimenting with what's currently in the landscape, and we thought that was a super helpful one that will assist us with diagnosing repositories to be archived. So
So a
let
good
me
way to
find the link.
prioritize which ones to put at the top of the list.
Oh, for sure. Yes. Okay, cool. And then it's this one over here. Okay, I'm dropping it in chat. Cool.
Thank you. That's really helpful.
Yes.
And David, you have a question?
Yeah. When you saw the banner, like when the actually create the banners on the top, is that what does it say? Is the banner says these have been archived, or there's a kind of a way of I don't know, adding some kind of reasoning of why this is an archive, or showing like alternatives of what to use if like does the action provides more things to do, or does one of the checklists to say, oh, by the way, add more information of what you expect the users to use now?
I see. Okay, I'm gonna share screen. Okay, cool. So the GitHub action, it does these 3 things, but actually I have a PR up where we kind of want to generalize the action so that it's more configurable. So speaking to, let me bring up the archive text. Okay, so speaking to your point about this archive text over here, So let's see. Yeah, so I added a feature where you can add your own custom archive text, which will be appended right over here. So this is personally the archival text that our organization decided to use, but there's also some best practices where you point other people to other repositories that users can use that instead of the one that is about to be archived. But here you can essentially just provide guidance on to users on how you want to approach things. Go ahead, Remy.
And one of the patterns that we've used in the past too, David, is that PRs are editable. So even if we have an automated tool that will generate the PR, the OSPO can go back in and then add custom text to it on a case-by-case basis. Along with that same like questions of like where you want to go. I don't know if Nat covered this, but there's sort of two parts to Repo Sunsetter, right? This is the part that says, we know we want to archive this repository. This is called what we're referring to as the path of archive. We also have this concept of the path of growth, which during the archival process, like maybe we can say like, hey, it looks like your project is a little bit stale, and coming up with like, if you'd like it to not be stale, here's a checklist of things you can do, like adding pull request templates or adding better contributor documentation or adding new issues that are labeled in a certain way to draw people towards parts of your project, or coming up with a little bit of like a fork in the road to say like, if you want to try and not go to the path of archival, here's how you can get your project back on track. And then we want to use that also as a leading indicator as well. So like maybe the sunsetting process starts by running the identification script. Identification script says, here are the stale repos. So we file our first issue on our repository that says, hey, looks like you're stale. If you want to go down the path of growth, here's some things we suggest you do. And then if that issue sits idle for a quarter and we run it again, we can say, okay, we told them about the path of growth. They didn't go down the path of the growth. Let's now change courses and suggest that they go down the path of archival. And then if that one sits unattended, the OSPO can come in and we can burn down through the tickets. And we want to keep track of all of the tickets that we have filed so that we can show progress and demonstrate value to the organization and say, like, we've identified this many inactive repos, we've converted this many to active repos, or we've archived this many. And that's part of our source code stewardship task force strategy to go through with our inventory work and make more sense of what's going on across our footprint in the ecosystem. We are still early on in this journey. We just shipped this tool, so we're not running it regularly. I saw a question in the chat from Travis that says, how often do you run this? Ideally, I think we're going to be running it probably on a quarterly basis, maybe a monthly basis if we wanted to, but quarterly is probably the right cadence. So this is something that's kind of new. I think we'll, like, as soon as we're happy with it, we'll start rolling it out across our own GitHub organization and then testing it in other GitHub organizations. There's probably about at least half a dozen GitHub orgs that are part of our footprint, plus a bunch of others that we don't know about yet too. So I think it's going to be a little bit of a patchwork process because each org will have different cycles that we go through. So a lot of this, we're still early on in the inventory process, but we're feeling better as we're starting to put some concrete code that actually runs and actions that we can enable.
Yeah, and one of the things we did at VMware, so we did that audit about quarterly. So we had a Python script that looked for inactive repos, and we ran it on a whole bunch of GitHub orgs because I think VMware had over 100 GitHub orgs that had come in through acquisitions and various things. It was a lot. And so we ran it on a whole bunch of different orgs. But the other thing we did, and this wasn't my idea, this was Stefka who worked on my team. She ran the whole sunsetting process. She put together a really detailed process for unarchiving. So she put together a process for this is what happens if you say that you want it archived and then you change your mind later. This is what we'll do. And it's fairly easy. We'll just bring it back. It's not a big deal. And that was a real turning point in convincing people to archive their repositories. Because I think a lot of people, when you say they're going to archive it, they're like, oh, it's forever. I can never get it back. What if I change my mind? Here's the funny thing, no one ever changed their mind, but knowing that they could made all the difference.
Don, it seems like you were ahead of the curve at VMware, just even addressing this issue. And compliments Remy and Natalia to your team, because this is really thoughtful and well worked out. But I'm curious if there's, maybe urgency is the wrong word, but some push to get on with focusing on this, either because of the EUCRA and not wanting to have stewardship assigned to these things, or just because people file pull requests and you just don't want to deal with it,
Yeah.
or something.
No, great question. I think that there's definitely value. Like, so we think about the layers of stakeholders in our OSPO, right? So the immediate stakeholders of the people within our community, developers need more support. You might have noticed, across tech and in the public sector, there have been a lot of reductions in force over the last year, maybe 4 years. So teams are getting smaller, contracts are being renegotiated or canceled. So a lot of that brings a more urgency to this type of an issue. And so that is an immediate concern. With the CRA, which I went to FOSDEM in a personal capacity over the past month and got to hear a lot more about the CRA. In the world of the United States federal government, I think that that's less of a concern because, we're in the United States. Not to say that we're not a member of the global open source community, but I think that we're the first federal OSPO, right? So I don't think that that's as much on the radar of, there's no specific open source program offices thinking about that at other agencies. That being said, I know there's cybersecurity concerns being upheld. That is the place where the federal government is actually really on top of the ball. So maybe there are other source code analysis and like cybersecurity functions for supply chain security that's more on their radar. But I think that, generally as like a steward of the code, like we just want to reduce our footprint and we want to be more intentional about saying like these are the active projects and these are the inactive projects so that we can direct the limited resources that we do have towards the projects that are in the best place to receive them, and also to provide like another layer of nuance. It's been really helpful back at Nadia's book, Working in Public, where she talks about the project classifications of like toy, federation, club, stadium, where you talk about like your composition of upstream developers and your users, and using that to describe more clearly or more like more specifically like what your open source project is. It's not just an open source project. It's an open source project of a certain size with a certain user base and a certain downstream and an upstream. So taking that same kind of classification and bringing it into the archival space where we can say like it's not just if it's an inactive project, it's a stable project, or it has an inactive downstream or a dormant upstream or a dormant downstream. We can say, this project is being used by lots of places inside the federal government, but the upstream community is dormant now. Like that is a different thing versus we have an active upstream community, but there's not a lot of downstream users of it. And I think that helps us to figure out like in a more clear way how to prioritize those kinds of projects. And we are helping to advise some other projects inside and outside the agency that have been impacted by reduction in force, and open source is a succession strategy. It really is important when you look at the inner source style models that are totally driven by internal teams and salaried people. When those communities lose their core contributors, how do you then provide succession And an open source strategy is one of the ways to help with that. It doesn't come without resource load or a lot of upfront work potentially, but it is a strategy to help to secure succession when there's a big change in the composition of the contributor community in a project.
Yeah, and to just to add to that a little bit, one of the reasons that we started doing this so early at VMware was frankly the Pivotal acquisition. So I came into VMware through the Pivotal acquisition, and Pivotal didn't have an OSPO, but we did have an open source everything by default strategy, which meant that this is partly how GitHub or how VMware ended up with over 100 GitHub orgs. And so we had so much open source and nobody looking after it. And so much of it was in need of being sunset and being archived because VMware's big concern was, hey, we've acquired this smaller company and people tend to trust big companies like VMware. They're like, oh, well, it's a VMware open source project, so it's probably, secure. And these abandoned repositories aren't, right? They've got all kinds of security vulnerabilities that have not been looked after. And so our concern was leaving these sit around is, potentially creating security problems for the people who trust the brand of the organization. So that was kind of why we started doing it. So we started this. It might have started a little bit before Pivotal was acquired. I can't remember exactly, but so this was around 2000 or so that we really started. Sorry, not 2000, 2020. It was right before the people started being locked down. So it was about 2020 that we really started doing a lot of this stuff.
You'd be really ahead of the curve if you're doing this in 2000.
Yeah, exactly. That was back in the days where all of the stuff was hosted in other places. There were, Git didn't even exist.
Yeah.
Any other comments, questions, thoughts on this topic? We also don't have any other agenda items, so we're free to keep talking about this if it's interesting to people. If you have something else you want to talk about, we have a few more minutes, so we could always talk about something else. It's up
I
to you.
have a sideline, but if other people want to talk about this, I'll hold on it because it's changing the subject a little bit.
I just have a question on when we were talking about tagging and giving the opportunity to grow. So this is kind of for the contributors, reminding them you have opened this repo here, you were maintaining it, and now it's kind of inactive. Do you want to bring it back? So, or this to let's say for the internal contributors or open source in general, like if somebody else picks it up, you would keep it open. What? Because yeah, if Remy, if you, I saw you nodding.
You want to take a stab at that, Nat, and I'll follow up?
You can do it, Remy.
Yeah. So one of the key pieces of guidance that our OSPO is like, there are many layers to the repository lifecycle, and the key one is our maturity models. So one of the things we're coming up with right now is, getting people from we don't know what our maturity model is to, okay, we think you're a one-time release, or we think you're an inner source project, or we think you're working a public project. And then knowing what maturity model you're in, then we can say, okay, what are the actions that can take you from base tier 2 to like advanced tier 2, from advanced tier 2 to base tier 3. So mapping the different pieces of guidance. And Nat, if you want to grab a link to the maturity model, the table with all the documentation guidance. So it's a little bit rigid, but structure is good. We found that our users really like to have more structure. So we can tell them things like, hey, you're a tier 2 project. Tier 2 project is an inner source style project. We notice that you don't have your agency mission. You don't have a code owner's file. You don't have like pull request templates. You don't have issue templates. If you wanted to go through this checklist, and add those kinds of things, then it would make it easier for people to make contributions. And
Right.
we also have this sense of, we gave a talk recently internally about like, is your project really open source if you don't accept pull requests from the outside world? And that's a really interesting question. In the OSPO, our guidance is sort of like open source is a journey, right? So it starts with making your repository public, right? So if you have a public repo and you're working in the open, then yes, you are open source. Then you should start to accept issues and take feedback from the community. And then once you start accepting feedback from the community, then you can start accept contributions from the community. And then once you start accepting contributions from the community, you can start to accept maintainers from the community. And then once you start accepting maintainers, eventually you can accept people into your governance process. So we see that as sort of a longitudinal journey at each layer of maturity. And we think we can help people, depending on what their goal is, to get to each of those hubs along the contributors path. And we have made it more clear with the maturity model framework, like what parts of what docs need to be where. It has been relatively straightforward to do the tier 0 through tier 2 because it's like that is a lot less specialized. It's like, hey, you should have issue templates, you should have pull request templates, you should have a contributor process. Like, it's easy to say, like, and here are some that we recommend. But when you get into the higher tiers of like shared community governance or working in public, that's where the like one size fits all guidance doesn't necessarily work as well. And you need the communities to opt in with their own thing. So some communities are very like inner source style driven, where they have timed releases and they go through like specific kinds of backlog grooming, and like all that stuff is very particular to their project and should be reflected in their path of growth, versus like something that's more of like a classic open source project that goes off of feature releases or doesn't have a very formal dev team or is very widely distributed, would look very different. So we don't have as much tier 4 guidance as we do for like tier 1 or tier 2. So we're filling in some of those gaps now too. But all of this stuff is, Nat has been incredible in driving so much of it and putting together so much of the tools, and they all build on the layers of documentation from the maturity models and the repository scaffolder work, and it's sort of putting it into place. And we're starting to consider, getting that back up into the CHAOSS community because we've been leaning on so much of the metrics work here.
Awesome. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you.
There was a side topic. I know we're getting
Yeah.
close to the end, but
Yeah, Ria, what's your side topic?
So you had mentioned that part of your motivation, Don, for doing this was all of the GitHub repos that you were managing as part of VMware back in the day, that there's 100 GitHub repos from various acquisitions and projects and spinoffs and everything else. And I have a similar situation. I've been just trying to figure out how to corral all of those, and I have index files and traffic cop files that, so I can just have a one-stop shop to know where everything is. But I'm wondering if this group has experience or suggestions about doing that type of corralling to give a better face to the public so they know where to find stuff. Is that a yes, you do have advice, or yes, you resemble that comment that you would like advice, Remy?
I've been doing a lot of talking, so I was going to give somebody else a chance before I started again, but I definitely have answers for this. So in government land, we have code.json, which is the metadata file that gathers up a lot of the information about what a project is and what it does and what its purpose is and where it is in its development lifecycle. And then that is supposed to go to an inventory on code.gov, where people can search through and find pre-existing repositories while they're doing their market analysis before they build or buy something. That was the intention. It's still uneven amounts of adoption is how I would describe it, but that's how it is in the federal landscape. In the international landscape, in the national landscape, you have like code inventories from Germany and the Netherlands and France, where they are using a similar metadata file to code.json, but it's probably like public code.yaml or code meta.json. So if you can go through, add a metadata file for each repository and then get it uploaded into an inventory, that's how the national governments are doing it. And that's how the International Project for Software Heritage Foundation, where they're cataloging all of Earth's source code as a UNESCO cultural heritage project. They use code meta JSON to do that. And they have forms for generating it, and they have some other tools around it too. So, we're hoping that part of our archival process on our roadmap is to create a converter that will take our federal standard metadata, convert it to the international standard, and ideally deposit it into the software heritage. But that's prospective future work. Shouldn't talk too much about that until we've shipped it. But those are some of the ways that we're thinking about that. To your question, like, how do we keep track of all this stuff? If you add metadata to every repository, at least then you can compare apples to apples, and you can use that to update your inventory and then provide an inventory, even if it's just like, a simple web page that just puts everything together, which is, what we've done with our fork of WCAG.
It sounds like that could also be really helpful from an inner source perspective for the stuff that you're not necessarily putting out in the public, but just to help your own organization find all the stuff.
Oh, 100%. And like even just simple keyword and labeling stuff is great. If you're like, this is a data science thing, or this is a Python thing, or this is a Java thing, like that alone really helps out, especially in like the government space where we have different programs like Medicare or Medicaid. People will ask like, hey, does anyone have a Python project that will crunch this stat for this state? And being able to say, yeah, I think there's a repo over here that does that, can really help to save a lot of time. And ideally, if you have like example scripts or libraries inside the firewall, is just as important, because we have all these tools that are common, the IDR and the CCW and random acronymy, but they're just like data sources where you can run scripts that are shared. And I know that those folks are looking to say, hey, I want to provide an inventory to other people so that they can run my scripts. It's not even necessarily like whole projects. It's just like playbooks and run books and stuff like that is super helpful in the inner source context.
Yeah, and the other thing we had within VMware was we had some internal tooling that we would onboard at least the most important organizations to, so that we could better manage things like access, so people could request access to things. And so there was a bunch of internal tooling that did various bits of maintenance around some of the GitHub org. So I don't know if that's necessarily the best solution, but it is another way to do it. All right, we have 1 more minute, so I'm just going to mention a couple of things. So the next meeting, which is on the 5th, so there's that working group within the to-do group that's focused on basically business of open source. And they're going to come in and talk to us a little bit about what they've been doing and some of the metrics that they've been talking about, and maybe get some suggestions from us about metrics as well from a kind of a business value standpoint. And Cornelius Schumacher is going to give that presentation, so that'll be on the 5th. We will also schedule a what do OSPOs need to be thinking about for AI. So I've talked to Emma; she's happy to do that. We just need to get it scheduled. And then the other things I wanted to mention, we have 2 conferences that have just opened their CFPs. One is the ASF's Community Over Code. All Things Open also opened their CFP. They've got kind of a different format this year, so I would encourage you to have a look at that. And then there's also, I think you talked about it at the last meeting that I missed, but there's an OSPO virtual conference that folks at Punch Tape are organizing. So that might also be interesting for folks. And with that, I think we're out of time. So thank you everybody so much for coming. I really appreciate it. This was a really, really interesting discussion. So thanks to folks at the CMS group, Natalia and Remy, for coming along and showing us some cool stuff.
Thank you.
Thanks
Thanks, everybody.
everyone.
Right.
Bye.
Bye-bye.